Lloyd de Jongh is a Catholic YouTuber who is probably most similar to Kennedy Hall out of all of the other people in the Catholic YouTube space. I think that single sentence is essentially all of the background that you're going to need before you watch this video. But yeah, Lloyd is a traditionalist. On Tuesday, January 30th, Lloyd did a stream titled Foolosophy, Woke, Transanity and Nominalism, Part 2. As I'm sure you can gather, Lloyd's argument was that nominalism is the root of all evil in today's world. Okay, perhaps that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not that far off from what Lloyd's actual position is. Let Lloyd tell you in his own words.
I am one of those stupid nominalists. I'm not a conceptualist. Your language is surprising. A Christian friend recommended your channel. Sorry, man. Look, this stuff is chopping the sex organs off children as young as 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. This is what they're doing, and this is what they want to do. This is destroying countries. This is destroying the church. This is destroying our society, right? This is ideological warfare. This is no longer a matter of, well, if we just give them the facts, they'll change their minds. No, they see you as the enemy and they will destroy you. Okay? This stuff upsets me.
And that wasn't the only back and forth that Lloyd and I had during that stream. Let me show you how the rest of it went.
So it's an interesting look at how realists were using Aristotle to justify slavery. Assume that you maintain that realism is not responsible. You know, Kevin, you are wasting my time. Okay? You are genuinely wasting my time right now. Right? So you are honestly, genuinely just... I've put you in timeout for 24 hours. Okay? So have a nice day. See you tomorrow.
At that point, I was timed out and I couldn't respond for the rest of that stream. But that didn't stop Lloyd from continuing to refer to me a few times later in the stream as that fool from earlier.
Notice that fool that came in earlier, he was trying to distract and deflect.
Oh well. I have found that it's pretty difficult to have conversations with the radder kinds of trads. But that didn't stop me from sending an email to Lloyd after he put me in timeout just to try a second time to actually, speak with him. On Thursday, February 1st, 2 days after that first stream and 2 days after I sent that email, Lloyd did another stream called Foolosophy, Woke, Transanity and Nominalism Part 3. I popped into the live chat again with the explicit intention of not riling up Lloyd or anyone else for that matter, just to ask Lloyd if he received my email and then super politely maybe offer some other thoughts. This is what happened when I asked Lloyd if that email address that I sent was the right email address for me to use.
I did get your email, Kevin. Yeah.
Okay, notice that he said he received it, not that he's going to respond. Anyway, later in the chat, let me show you what happened because he wound up putting me in another timeout.
Nominalists do not hold that reality is subjective. All nominalists do is reject the existence of abstraction. That is all. That's so nice. Do you speak for all nominalists, Kevin? I mean, are you the king of the nominalists? Are you the president of the nominalists? So you only speak for yourself, understand? That is purely your opinion. And of course, according to nominalists, there is no outside objective world. Everything is true only for you. So that is true purely for you. So you should say, my opinion is. Please preface all of your terms with my opinion is. Yes, it is just your own opinion. It is nothing more than your own opinion, right? So yeah, I know exactly. There's that one lovely paper by that one fool you're reading. I mean, seriously, go and invent mathematics without numbers. That's what nominalists do. So the SCP defines it. I agree with your point about atheism. No, you guys are just as there's nothing different. So anyway, it's been nice, but we'll see you in a while.
Lloyd hasn't responded to my email that I sent on Tuesday, and today is Saturday, February 3rd, meaning that as of recording, it's been over 4 days since I sent that email, and I don't plan on posting this video for a few days anyway, so by the time that you see this video, it will have been probably close to a week, if not over a week, without getting a response. If I do get a response, I probably won't post this video, or I will post the video depending on what Lloyd's response is. Check the description down below and I'll give you like the most up-to-date news on whether or not I've heard back from Lloyd. Anyway, I'm not holding my breath. I think the fact that he timed me out twice for questions that I thought were fairly polite does not make me optimistic that I should expect to receive a response from him. So since I seemingly can't talk to Lloyd directly, this video will have to do. This video is going to be a parody of Lloyd's stream. I don't mean parody in the like haha so funny kind of way, but in the gastronomic realism kind of way. Gastronomic realism is a paper that is, per its own abstract, devoted to making out the case for just such a parity of treatment between moral realism and gastronomic realism. And that is exactly what I intend to do in today's video. I aim to parody the nominalism is the root of all evil argument to show that there should be parity between Lloyd's argument and the argument that I will make today, which is, if nominalism is destroying the lives of children, then realism is responsible for slavery. Then I'm going to discuss why I don't accept either one of those arguments, but why what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Let's talk about it. Okay, so again, I am going to lay out an argument that I do not actually support. I don't actually believe that this argument is the case. I do not think that realism, whether it be moderate realism or Platonic realism or any kind of realism, is actually responsible for slavery. I don't think that any philosophies per se can inspire anybody to act in hardly any way. And I think that the belief that something like nominalism in it, like by itself is capable of inspiring such action. Hey, Kevin from the future here. So I realized that I went this entire video without ever actually telling anyone my stance on just whether or not it is good or bad to be a trans person in the first place. I don't think that my personal opinion really impacts any of the arguments that I make here, but just in the interest of having full cards on the table, I do support trans rights. I think that really any adult should be able to do whatever they want to do. I generally view surgery as like a last line of defense. If conditions can be treated without surgery, that's preferable to treating conditions with surgery. But if surgery is needed, and a medical doctor is saying that it's needed, I don't think that the state should get in the way. So yeah, I'm in full favor of trans rights. Back to your regular scheduled video. I think just flies in the face of modern cognitive science. But I'm going to defend the argument that if nominalism is responsible for destroying the lives of children, then realism is responsible for slavery. To start with, let's go with the inventor of moderate realism himself, Aristotle, and see what Aristotle says about slavery. Reading from Aristotle's Politics, Book 1, Part 2. In the first place, there must be a union of those who cannot exist without each other, namely of male and female, that the race may continue, and of natural ruler and subject, that both may be preserved. For that which can be foreseen by the exercise of mind is by nature intended to be lord and master, and that which can with its body give effect to such foresight is a subject, and by nature a slave. Hence, master and slave have the same interest. Now, nature has distinguished between the female and the slave, and so Aristotle continues to let us know that indeed women and slaves are different, you see. Thank you, Aristotle. Later in Book 1, Part 5, Aristotle asks, but is there any one thus intended by nature to be a slave, and for whom such a condition is expedient and right? Or rather, is not all slavery a violation of nature? There is no difficulty in answering this question, on grounds of both reason and of fact. For that some should rule and others should be ruled is not a thing only of necessity, but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjugation, and others for rule. That was how he opened Book 1, Part 5, and then he ends Part 5 by saying this particularly disgusting line. It is clear then that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter, slavery is both expedient and right. Then in Part 6, Aristotle very generously and mercifully lets us all know that some slavery is indeed unjust. You see, some men are born with the nature or form of being a slave, while others are born with the nature or form of being a free man. And it would be unjust to enslave somebody who had the nature of a free man. And the proponents of chattel slavery in the American colonial South were big fans of Aristotle. For evidence of this, I turn to the Southern Literary Messenger, a pro-slavery, at least pro-slavery prior to the Civil War, periodical, widely read among educated men in both the North and the South, which published articles proving that slavery was natural, good, and just in the Aristotelian sense. An anonymous author declared, "To Aristotle, one of the most profound of the philosophers of antiquity, we confidently appeal, and with more confidence, because in this iron age of utilitarianism, his material philosophy, fortified with the powers of the greatest, wisest, and meanest of mankind, has been preferred to the spiritual sublimity of the divine Plato. Aristotle has expressly declared that, quote, in the natural state of man, from the origin of things, a portion of the human family must command, and the remainder obey. That the distinction of which exists between a master and servant is a distinction at once natural and indispensable, and that when we find existing among men free men and slaves, it is not man, but nature herself who has ordained the distinction." Now, to be fair, Aristotle did not say exactly the same thing that the Southern Literary Messenger did. As S. Sarah Monison has pointed out in her work, Recollecting Aristotle, Pro-Slavery Thought in Antebellum America, and The Argument of Politics, Book 1, quote, Aristotle dismisses body type as a reliable indicator of free or slave by nature, even though natural slaves will still be especially suited to hard physical labor. As a matter of fact, he acknowledges, quote, slaves often have the bodies of free men. Moreover, it does not even occur to Aristotle to consider skin color as a useful sign. He does not trust physical markers at all. She does go on to note that many Southerners relied on mistranslations of Aristotle's writing or read their own biases into him, but she does come back around to saying that not all pro-slavery Southerners did indeed rely on poor translations or misunderstandings of Aristotle. On pages 268 to 270, Monison discusses the work of George Frederick Holmes, and in particular his 1850 essay, Observations on a Passage in the Politics of Aristotle Relative to Slavery, which was published by, funnily enough, the Literary Messenger. Only 12 years after Thoughts on Slavery, which we just looked at, which was by an anonymous author. In Holmes's 1850 essay, he explicitly admits that Aristotle did not claim that black people were naturally suited to slavery, but then Holmes claims that this was merely because Aristotle did not have as much expertise with black people as 19th century American Southerners did. And if Aristotle did have as much experience with black people as these Southern American plantation owners did, then Aristotle would indeed approve of racial chattel slavery. Holmes tells his readers that Aristotle only came to the abhorrent belief that certain white people, like those Northern European barbarians, could be enslaved is because Aristotle didn't have enough data from the historical record to induce the truth that black people were the natural slaves, not white people. As I'm sure you can imagine, modern folks who are big fans of the tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas strongly contest that natural law theory can be used to justify slavery. Perhaps the most well-known Thomist, Ed Feser, writes about racism in The Last Superstition, on page 108 very briefly, but then he leaves a superscript 9, which brings us to the endnotes. See here, endnote 9 in chapter 4. This is from page 199 in the electronic copy that I have. that one human being can literally own another as his property, or kidnap another and make him a slave, or that some races are naturally suited to be enslaved by others, are notions condemned by natural law theory as intrinsically immoral. And then skipping to the last sentence, and the suggestion that the legitimacy of racial chattel slavery, as it was known in early American history, follows from natural law theory is, as I say, a slander. Can you slander a belief? Can you slander natural law theory? Can you slander nominalism? If you can, then I think that Lloyd slanders nominalism, but anyway, this is all besides the point. Fraser claimed that natural law theory, originated by Aristotle among others, condemned slavery as intrinsically immoral, and that it's slanderous to claim that American racial chattel slavery could have been possibly legitimized by natural law theory. But Aristotle, as we just saw, never condemned slavery on natural law grounds. Aristotle thought that slavery was fine and that it was natural. He clearly very much so disagrees with what Fraser just wrote there. And while American slave owners weren't 100% correct in their readings of Aristotle, they still used him enthusiastically to justify their regime. It is therefore not at all a slander to say that natural law, the natural law tradition, exemplified by Aristotle at least, could be and has been used to justify racial chattel slavery. Now, I don't think that Fraser is a racist who supports race-based slavery, not for 1 second. In a 2020 blog post, Fraser wrote the following: "There could be no clearer manifestation of racism in the sense than the institutions of slavery and segregations that once existed in the United States. The falsity and evil of racism, and thus those institutions, clearly follows from the standard scholastic thinking about human nature and natural law, and perhaps the best known examples of scholastic thinkers who make this case are Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolomeo de las Casas." Fraser then goes on to talk about why these 15th and 16th century thinkers were using natural law to argue against slavery. Now, I think that this passage makes it clear. Fraser thinks that racism is evil. Yay, Fraser. Great. Okay, fantastic. Now, I don't think that, so despite the fact that I don't think that Fraser is a racist at all or supports slavery in any manner, I also don't think it's any more slanderous to say that natural law leads to slavery than it is to say that nominalism leads to the harming of children. And look, I get it. People like Fraser, Lloyd, and others would argue that the articles written in the Southern Literary Messenger are simply incorrectly applying natural law theory. Real natural law theory has never been tried. But it just seems equally as easy to me that a nominalist could say, yeah, like any reading of nominalism that is justifying any morals whatsoever, actually, is just not a correct, like all nominalism is the rejection of universals. It makes no comment at all on morality. So nominalism couldn't even in principle justify harming children. I mean, really, nominalism couldn't justify, helping children either. It's not an ethical framework. That's just not how it works. And so if that option is available to the realist, that option has to be available to the nominalist as well. I mean, almost anything could be used to justify almost anything, right? Natural law has been used to justify slavery, and it's been used to condemn slavery. Nominalism, according to Lloyd, has been used to justify harming children, but that's probably not surprising that anything can be used to justify anything, because people can make any kind of claim that they want. To really drive this point home, that people can use nominalism or realism to promote or reject almost anything, I'd like to present 2 papers. Remember, Lloyd's whole point here is that nominalism is bad because it leads to people accepting like transgender people as like legitimately the gender that they identify as, or perhaps his argument is like nominalism is evil because it leads to the acceptance of transgenderism as a legitimate phenomenon. Lloyd would say realism cannot allow for transubstantiation at all and is therefore like superior to nominalism. And that's just not the case at all. That sentence that I just said there is simply not the case. Realism can be, and indeed has been used to promote transgenderism. In a 2019 essay from Xavier College titled The Metaphysics of Gender, Essence, or Existence, the author argues that the concept of gender has undergone drastic change in the postmodern era. Once accepted as a binary between male and female, gender is now widely considered a spectrum by current scholars. Modern gender scholars, such as these, reject Aristotle on the basis that his anti-feminist rhetoric lends no use to current gender studies. The goal of this paper is to look back at Aristotle's metaphysics and see if anything in it could clarify the status of gender. A little later on, the conclusion reached is that there is, in fact, a way to interpret Aristotle that does not contradict modern gender studies, and even if he might not have intended that interpretation. In fact, even taking the full essentialist interpretation of Aristotle, it can be compatible with a gender spectrum. Ultimately, I conclude that while having a gender itself is an essential attribute that cannot change, particular manifestations of gender are accidental and fluid. Part of the human form is the fact that one has a gender while the particular manifestations of gender in each person arise in matter in the matter-form composite. Now, this was Dr. Christina Peterman's dissertation, so maybe you want to argue that this wasn't written by somebody with a PhD, therefore we can't trust it, or something. Well, if that's your argument, then I'm going to redirect you to Trans Women Are Real Women, a critical realist intersectional response to Pilgrim, which was published in the Journal of Critical Realism, Volume 17, in 2018. By now, I like to think that I have forwarded the claim that many pro-slavery intellectuals relied on Aristotle's brand of realism as a way to justify and promote slavery, and that the counter-arguments against this claim either fail or pass, but will either fail or pass for both claims against realism and claims against nominalism. Should we therefore make the claim, as Lloyd does, that a philosophical position on the existence of universals is responsible for atrocities like slavery? Well, like I've said a few times now, I reject both. I reject that nominalism is responsible for harming children, and I reject that realism is responsible for American antebellum slavery. And why do I reject both? My rejection is based on one fact, that human psychology is just way more complicated than that. No beliefs are formed in this super simplistic way that some nominalism phobes like to think. Nobody thinks to themselves, you know what? Yesterday, I was convinced that universals do exist. Today, I actually don't think that universals exist. Now I think it's okay to harm children. Nobody thinks like that. Nobody thinks, yesterday, I was convinced that slavery is indeed wrong because I didn't think that there was like the nature of a slave. But now I think that natures do indeed exist. I became a realist. Now I think that slavery is okay. Human psychology simply does not work that way. And cognitive scientists have been saying this for decades. I found this paper from Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience called Revealing the Cognitive Neuroscience of Belief. And while this is an opinion piece, the section that I would like to quote from for this video should be fairly uncontroversial. A related challenge for research has been the inherent complexity of belief. Beliefs exist within broader networks of related beliefs, making discrete beliefs difficult to study in isolation. Beliefs also interact with many lower-level cognitive processes, such as attention, perception, and memory. Given such close interrelationships with automatic cognitive processes, Fodor argues that belief could not be decomposed into discrete, independent subcomponents or localized neuroanatomically, limiting the viability of scientific study. By the way, that 1970 book called The Web of Belief was written by the American philosopher and logician William Van Orman Quine, who was recognized as one of the most influential philosophers in the 20th century. And Jerry Fodor, it was the author of The Modularity of Mind, an essay on faculty psychology. And that was the other book mentioned here. Fodor is recognized as having an enormous influence on virtually every portion of the philosophy of mind literature since 1960, according to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So nothing in that paragraph that I just read should be considered controversial, despite the fact that this was an opinion piece from Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience. All of that to say, belief formation is very complicated. It's not as simple as saying, oh, you believe that racism is chill because you're a realist. It's not as simple as saying, oh, you think it's fine to harm children because you're a nominalist. And frankly, it strikes me as very tribalistic to think otherwise. I have said this once, and I will say it again. To the people like Lloyd and the people like Kennedy Hall, nominalism is the boogeyman. Everything that goes wrong is nominalism's fault. Nominalism is just synonymous with modernism. And obviously, I contest that nominalism is the same thing as modernism, but anyway, it's all the same to some types of people. And I suspect that this has a lot more to do with in-group, out-group dynamics than it has to do with any kind of rigorous philosophical inquiry. And I just think it's a real shame to go about thinking through things in philosophy through such a tribal lens. Thanks, everybody. I would be remiss if I didn't cite one source here that I never actually put on the screen, but that was it was a huge help in writing the script for this video, and that would be Gunther Laird's The Unnecessary Science. In particular, he has a whole chapter that he calls Aristotelian Atrocities, which is just like, hey, look, like, you know, people were using realism to justify terrible things before. So this isn't like a new thing that people are using. Like, you know, nominalism is not unique here. Also, I could talk a lot more about like Lloyd's weird attitude towards philosophy. Like, Lloyd seems to be purposefully ignorant about what nominalism is. At some points, Lloyd was telling me that I can't even like make any claims about reality. I just have to say my opinion is this, that, or the other. But I can't say like anything is true or false because I'm a nominalist. which just is a complete misunderstanding of what nominalism is, right? It's just the rejection of universals. So in Lloyd's mind, he has clearly like conflated nominalism with like a lot of other positions that are just simply not entailed by the rejection of universals. And Lloyd doesn't seem interested at all in actually like finding this out. I told him like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines what nominalism is this way. And he pretty much just said like, oh yeah, okay, well, that's not how all the nominalists act. And I'm like, Lloyd, how many nominalists have you actually spoken to? You're not going to talk to me. I don't think you're going to talk to any like PhD philosophers either. So anyway, I could go on forever about that, but this video is probably like over 30 minutes long already. So I have to call it somewhere. I'm going to call it here. Also, I think everybody has to take a shot because I made another video on nominalism. Okay. Thanks, everyone.